Hey, hi, welcome to your Unit 4 set of videos. Make sure you know exactly what to do for this set, and have a great day. Alrighty, my friends. So this is video number 3, where our topic is economic growth and social development, where it might not seem like a really interesting topic, but I swear it is. We're looking a little bit deeper into how cities developed in Europe after it was completely cityless. Because if you last remember, when we looked at Europe, it was essentially just a place ruled by feudalism, which was essentially created just because so many people were terrified of invaders and of the unknown because the Roman Empire fell. But as feudalism was being slowly eradicated, now you have the development of cities, which is pretty interesting, if you ask me. So, our objectives for today. Number 1, what factors led to the development of cities? Were the development of cities a positive or a negative event, in your own opinion? And lastly, what are the most prominent or important social changes that occurred? Once again, in your own opinion. So let's go ahead and get started with the growth of agricultural economy. So, as regional states provided increasingly effective political organization, medieval Europe experienced dramatic economic growth and social development. Economic rival closely resembled the processes that happened in China and India and the Islamic worlds. There is a huge increase of agricultural production, urbanization, manufacturing, and trade that transformed Europe into a powerful society. So, at first, we're going to go ahead and look and focus on the agricultural economy and a couple of different components with it. So, there was a dramatic increase in agricultural yields, which essentially became the foundation of an economic growth and social development in Europe. It's a pretty common thing that we've been looking at all throughout this semester, right? More food equals more people equals, hey, you have cities. But in this sense, there are several reasons why. First is opening new lands to cultivation, improved agricultural techniques, use of new tools and technologies, as well as introduction to new crops. And I only want to focus on a couple of these, so we're going to go ahead and focus on expansion of arable lands, aka more lands. As local lords began easing up their control of their lands, because, the end of various invasions that were going on that led to feudalism, as I stated before, Europe began to experience an increase in population. And because of this population, in response to it, there is a huge increase in deforestation, draining of swamps, in order to increase land to cultivate, because there is this huge population, huge demand, but also a huge workforce needed to do something as well. There is some opposition, especially from the lords, because it would reduce the amount of land available for hunting. But then they gradually started to realize that expanding agricultural land was a lot better for them in the long run because of taxing. Taxing equals increase in personal wealth for the lords. So they happily accepted the fact that their hunting grounds would be much more restricted. So, looking at improved agricultural techniques. There was a huge reliance on improved methods of cultivation and better agricultural technology that led to higher productivity. Refined and improved techniques started to obviously gain a larger yield for crops. And one of the most focused crops during this time was beans. Ooh, wow, exciting, I know. But one of the things that's really awesome about beans is the fact that they produce a lot of nitrogen for the soil. And that's something that's really needed in order to promote a healthy soil so that your land can still be cultivated, season after season after season. So beans was one of the primary crops during this time. But there's also a lot more domestic animals coming forth here. Specifically, beasts of burden were being turned into sources of food. For example, cows, instead of having cows or oxen being used to pull and drag things, now they're mainly being used either for their meat or most likely for their milk. Next, you have a lot of created ponds in order to raise fish and then, encourage fishing. And new crops and techniques led to an increased understanding of agricultural affairs. And these techniques spread like wildfire through books that were mostly written by monks during this time. Looking at some new tools and technologies, as you can see here in these diagrams, you got some horseshoes, and then you got a horse collar. So these two primary inventions increased the amount of land that was able to work on. For example, horseshoes prevented softened and split hooves on horses, which allowed them to continue working and moving and plowing various stuff. And the actual horse collar was placed heavy loads on the animal's chest and shoulders as opposed to on their necks for not only better movement and control for the plow and for the plow to go faster, but also it's incredibly better for the animal and they're less likely to die or feel strained or go slower because it's a little bit more comfortable on their bodies. So now we're going to move forward to a new topic of the revival of towns and trade. And we're going to focus on urbanization here for a moment. So just so you know, if you don't know actually, urbanization is just the movement of people's moving to a city as opposed to a town or somewhere on the outskirts of a city. So the abundance of food supplies equaled, a huge supports in the large number of urban residents that were coming into these newfound locations. You have a lot of artisans, craft workers, merchants, and professionals that were coming into the cities as well. Peasants and serfs from the countryside flocked to established cities and founded new towns to either start a new life or just to have more of an income. Cities founded during the Roman times became thriving centers for government and businesses. For example, Paris and London were two very established Roman Empire towns that would later turn into major cities during the medieval period. So you can still see the remnants, of the Roman Empire through the expansion of cities itself. For the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, cities began to play a major role in European economic and social development. So let's dive in a little bit more into the features of towns and cities and trade by starting off with textile production. So with towns and cities being more frequent and developing and, popping up, this led to an increase in specialized labor, which resulted in a dramatic expansion of manufacturing and trade. Manufacturing was mainly with wool textiles, and wool textiles was mainly manufactured by women in these large cities, which is a pretty cool thing to have because now you have more of a presence in the workforce for women as opposed to just being like domestic care workers. Looking at Mediterranean trade, and I know this map right here is just really, really bad, but I think it's so awesome. So hopefully you can decipher it, even though it's super duper pixely. So a revival of urban society, was very prominent, especially in Italy, which, if you remember, Italy is the beginning of the Roman Empire, but also is one of the most prominent areas for the Mediterranean basin. And it touched almost every single part of the trade networks that was coming in and out of Europe. Next, we have improved business techniques. So an increase in trade because, through Italy and through all of these major cities, it encouraged the development of credit system, of a banking system, and of new forms of businesses. And banking is not a European invention. The idea of banking and credit has been incredibly prevalent, specifically in post-classical China and the Islamic world. So Europe was pretty far behind when it comes to this concept, but it was incredibly useful, especially for the merchant class, because banks would issue letters of credit. In other words, you got a piece of paper that was officiated by a bank saying this piece of paper is worth this amount of gold, coins, silver, whatever kind of currency that you're looking at. And by doing this and by giving this to merchants, it essentially freed the merchants from risks of carrying too much cash. Cash. And potentially losing it or having it stolen or just like weighing you down. And without this system, it would have been almost impossible for merchants during this time to trade on a large scale. And when I say large scale, I mean outside of Europe. It would have been possible for them to trade with Northern Africa, the Islamic Empire, even all the way to China with Marco Polo. Without this, really would not have happened. And that cross-cultural exchange probably wouldn't have happened either. So looking at social change, and this is our last major topic for this video. And I would highly encourage you to take a moment here to look at these images because they're incredibly awesome. And they're actually going to really detail and explain some stuff that we're going to learn more about, particularly next unit. So looking at social change, one of the most prominent concepts is with the three estates. And these four images showcase the three different estates that I'll explain in just one moment. Once again, these three estates are going to be very important for our upcoming unit, especially when we talk about France. But it's essentially a medieval social structure where a lot of historians frequently held that European society embraced three estates or three classes. Quote, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Well, what does that mean? Well, those who pray, perhaps it's a little bit self-explanatory. They are at the top of an estate. And these are, the clergy, specifically for the Roman Catholic Church. And they were the spiritual estate. Their loyalty was to the church as opposed to any secular rulers. And right beneath them is going to be the fighter class. And this is actually the noble class. You wouldn't really associate fighters with nobles. You normally would associate fighters with knights, but here we are. A lot of these nobles would inherit their positions in society and received an education that concentrated on equestrian and military skills, aka a lot of nobles had to be educated on how to ride a horse, how to fight on horseback, as well as just general military skills with the sword and shield. And then lastly, of course not least, you got our lovely worker class. This is the vast majority of the population. They cultivated land as peasants, which meant that they were incredibly dependent on protection on their lords, and those lords are the fighter class, right? So kind of the feudalism is still being alive and being brought into the three estates. And these three estates, or this social change, showed some important truths about medieval Europe. Sorry, I'm just trying to... Okay. It clearly reflected a society marked by political, social, and economic inequality. showcased here. So looking at a specific part about the social class system changes, however you'd like to name it, is a very interesting event or code called chivalry. So within the ranks of the nobles, there was a huge emphasis on chivalry and courtly behavior. There is huge expectations of high ethical standards and refined manners, where the nobles were encouraged to be warriors, and those warriors were encouraged to become cultivator leaders of society. In other words, these warriors are encouraged to be as courtly, as mannerly, as polite as possible because they are leading this vast majority of the peoples. Chivalry was an informal but widely recognized code of ethics and behavior considered appropriate for nobles. It was essentially devoting himself, and nobles during this time, I am referring to the masculine here, devoting himself to causes of order, piety, and essentially being a good Christian. And something that comes out of chivalry is troubadours. So aristocratic women were seeing how this new chivalrous class were portraying themselves, and they really liked this idea and this code, and they tried to spread the values of what chivalry was all about. But mind you, it was only with aristocratic women. They're the ones that actually were receiving this type of attention. They, however, wanted to specifically promote refined behavior and tenderness, respectful relations also among the sexes. This type of idea survived in songs and poems of the troubadours, and they are a class of traveling poets, minstrels, and entertainers, and they were patronized by women, right? Women were sponsoring them. They are more active in southern France and northern Italy during this time. And one woman who was a huge proponent of this was a very influential lady here named Eleanor of Aquitaine. So she was alive during the late 12th and 13th century, where a bunch of troubadours traveled to her aristocratic court. She is, in fact, a queen. Where she would reward these troubadours for coming in, for singing their songs, for kind of showcasing what a noble could and should be like. The queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, supported romantic poets and entertainers, and she's one of the most celebrated women of her time, but also I would say even to this day. She was Queen of France, of England, and she also led a crusade to the Holy Lands during the Crusades, which is pretty awesome that a woman would go out and say, hey guys, I'm going to go fight with you. Let's go reclaim Jerusalem for our own. She used her influence to encourage the cultivation of good manners, refinement, and romantic love. And the combination of chivalry and troubadours gradually softened the manners of nobility. So now, instead of the nobility trying to make themselves seem like super duper harsh warriors, they're now expected to be kind, ethical Christian leaders. And many of them did hold up to this type of idea. Now, second to last topic, we're moving on to guilds. So medieval towns and cities reflected the interests and contributions of the working classes, where merchants and workers in all arts, crafts, and trades organized guilds that regulated the production and sales of goods within their jurisdiction. And a guild essentially controlled much of the urban economy of medieval Europe, where they established standards of quality for manufactured goods, sometimes even requiring members to adopt specific techniques of production. and they determined the prices at which members had to sell their products. In other words, a guild was there for a lot of different reasons. I would say think of it kind of as like a union, like a labor union, because they were definitely there for these, individual workers. They were there to help maintain a balanced supply and demand system for products, as well as to protect their members' interests. They regulated the entry of new workers into their social groups, and they had a huge social significance as well. They would provide friendship to people, mutual support, and aid of family members, whether it's financial aid or perhaps moral support if anything went sour. And lastly, let's go ahead and take a moment to look at some urban women. So, countryside women continued to perform the same kind of task that their ancestors had in the early Middle Ages. They would do a lot of domestic chores. They would, like milk cows, help cultivate the land, etc. But urban women were offered a fresh new perspective on life and new opportunities, specifically with occupation. Their jobs were kind of endless, they're very versatile. And a lot of guilds would actually admit and ask women to join their group. And some guilds were exclusively female only. With this increasing prominence of women, it shows the significance of towns and cities as agents of social change in medieval Europe, which I think is pretty cool. And that, my friends, is where we're going to end our class for today. So, what did we learn? That is what you are going to be answering on Flipgrid for me. Now that you're done with that video, once again, make sure you know exactly what you need to do for this, and I'll see you next time.